In 1896, a town just south of Chicago was named the most perfect town in the world. The judges came from an international exposition in Prague, and they meant it. Clean streets, no slums, no saloons, a library, a theater, a lake. 18 years earlier, none of it had existed. 2 years before the award, federal troops had marched through those same streets, and men had died on them. The man who built the town would be buried in a grave lined with concrete and steel, so no one could ever reach him. This is how perfection became a trap. If you've ever wondered how good intentions build the most efficient cages, subscribe and stay with me. The story of Pullman is one of those. The story of how a town could be built to perfect a man and end up breaking him begins, like the best of these stories do, with a problem nobody else had thought worth solving. In the middle of the 19th century, train travel in America was a misery. The rails were new, the country was vast, and a journey across it took days. Passengers slept sitting up or did not sleep at all, packed into wooden cars that froze in winter and stifled in summer, lit by guttering oil lamps, jolting over uneven track. Crude sleeping cars already existed, with shelves bolted to the walls and curtains for privacy, and they were filthy. No one of means wanted to be seen in them. The problem was obvious to every traveler. The opportunity was visible to almost no one. George Mortimer Pullman saw it. He was born in 1831 in upstate New York, the third of 10 children, the son of a general mechanic. He had little formal schooling. What he had instead was an instinct for moving heavy things. His first real trade was raising buildings, lifting them off their foundations and setting them on higher ground. When the Erie Canal was widened, his father had patented a device for moving structures, and the young Pullman carried the business to Chicago, where the entire city was sinking into the mud beside Lake Michigan and needed to be hauled out of it. Through the 1850s and 60s, Pullman jacked up hotels, stores, whole blocks of brick, sometimes with the guests still inside and dinner still being served, raising them an inch at a time on thousands of screw jacks turned by hundreds of men in perfect unison. He lifted the 4-story Tremont house without cracking a window pane. He learned, in those years, how to command labor at scale, how to make a small army move as a single body. He would not forget the lesson, but buildings were not where the fortune was. The fortune was on the rails. Pullman built his first true sleeping car around 1864 with a partner named Ben Field and a budget that horrified everyone who heard it. He called it the Pioneer, and it cost more than 5 times what an ordinary sleeping car cost, something over $20,000, when the average car ran 4. It was wider than any car before it and taller, with hinged upper berths that folded into the ceiling, plush upholstery, polished woodwork, marble fittings, and chandeliers. It was, in fact, too large. It was too wide for the station platforms and too tall for the bridges, and so for a year it sat, a beautiful, useless thing, a luxury with nowhere to go. Then in April 1865, Abraham Lincoln was murdered. The funeral train carried the president's body west toward Springfield, Illinois, and the story, the one Pullman would let everyone believe for the rest of his life, is that the Pioneer was chosen to carry the mourning family on the final leg, and that to let it pass, the railroads hurriedly cut down platforms and raised bridge clearances along the route. Whether it happened exactly that way matters less than what it did. The nation read about the magnificent car that had borne Lincoln home. The bridges were now cut to fit it, and George Pullman's name was made. He had learned the second lesson of his life. The product did not need to be advertised. It needed only to be seen by the right eyes at the right moment. He founded the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1867. And then he did something cleverer than build cars. He refused to sell them. Other manufacturers built sleeping cars and sold them to the railroads. Pullman kept his. He built the cars, leased them to the railroads, and operated them himself, staffing each one with a conductor and a porter, collecting a fee from every passenger who lay down to sleep. The railroad supplied the track and the locomotive. Pullman supplied the experience and took a cut of it forever. It was a service, not a sale, and it meant that as the country threaded itself together with steel, as the network swelled from a few thousand miles to tens of thousands, Pullman's revenue grew with every mile of it without his laying a single rail. By the 1870s, his green and gold cars ran on railroads across the continent. The word Pullman stopped being a name and became a thing you rode in. He was, by any measure, among the richest men in America, and he was not yet 50. A man like that could have stopped. Pullman did not stop because something he had seen frightened him. In the summer of 1877, the country erupted. Wage cuts on the Baltimore and Ohio railroads set off the Great Railroad Strike, and it spread along the rails like fire along a fuse, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, until militia were firing into crowds, roundhouses were burning, and more than 100 people lay dead. It was the largest labor uprising the country had yet seen, and it ended only when the army came. Pullman watched it from Chicago, where the violence reached his own doorstep, and he drew from it a conclusion that would shape the rest of his life and the lives of thousands of others. The problem, as he understood it, was not wages. The problem was the worker himself, or rather, the world the worker went home to. The slums of Chicago were filthy, drunken, crowded, and seething, and a man who lived in such a place came to work angry, came to work hungover, came to work ready to listen to agitators. Clean the environment, Pullman reasoned, and you clean the man. Give him a decent house, a green lawn, a library instead of a saloon, and you would get back a sober, grateful, productive worker who would never strike. This was the idea, and here is the part that matters, the part to hold on to as everything else unfolds. It was not charity. Pullman did not propose to give his workers anything. He proposed to build them a town and rent it back to them, every house, every loaf of bread, every book. And he expected the whole arrangement to return him a profit of 6%. Remember the 6%. It is the number the entire story turns on. He would be benefactor and landlord at once. He would improve their lives and bill them for the improvement. He had lifted whole buildings out of the mud without breaking a pane of glass. Now he would lift an entire class of men, and he was certain, absolutely certain, that they would thank him for it. The town did not grow the way towns grow. It did not begin with a crossroads and a tavern and a crete, over generations into something larger. It was conceived all at once, on paper, by men who had never lived there and never would, and it was built the way Pullman did everything, completely, deliberately, and on a scale designed to impress. In 1880, Pullman began quietly buying land 14 miles south of Chicago, on the marshy western shore of Lake Calumet. He did it through agents, so that no one would understand what was assembling, and he did it from 75 separate owners, parcel by parcel, until he had 4,000 acres. He paid $800,000 for the lot. The site was not chosen for its beauty. It was chosen because the lake offered water, the prairie offered room, and the rail lines that already ran south out of Chicago offered a way to move locomotives, lumber, and men. The clay of the lake bed offered something else, something Pullman noticed and put to use. You could dig it up and fire it into brick, and so the town would, quite literally, be built out of the ground it stood on. To design it, Pullman hired a young architect named Solon Spencer Beeman. Beeman was not yet 30. He was brought in alongside a landscape architect named Nathan Barrett and a civil engineer, and together they were handed a commission almost no one in America had ever been given, not to design a building or a street, but a complete human settlement. Every house and shop and church and park and sewer, all at once, all of a piece, for a population that did not yet exist. What they produced was, by the standards of the time, astonishing. The houses were brick, in an age when working men lived in wooden tenements that rotted and burned. They had indoor plumbing, gas, and running water, when most American homes had none of these things. They came in grades. Larger homes with more ornament for foremen and skilled men, smaller flats for laborers, so that a man's address announced his rank, and so that rising in the company meant rising visibly onto a better street. The streets themselves were named for inventors and engineers, for Watt and Fulton and Stephenson, men who had bent machinery to human use, which is what Pullman believed he was doing with men. There were no squalid alleys of the usual kind. Garbage was collected, sewage was carried south to a company farm where it fertilized crops that were sold back at a profit, because in Pullman's town even waste was made to earn its keep. At the center stood the things that made visitors gasp. The Arcade, a vast covered building of shops and offices, with a theater and a library of some 8,000 volumes, one of the first indoor shopping centers of its kind in the country, so that a resident need never leave town to buy a coat or borrow a book. The Hotel Florence, named for Pullman's favorite daughter, elegant enough for the businessmen and dignitaries who came to marvel, and pointedly the only place in town where alcohol was served at prices and in a setting that working men could not afford and were not welcome in. There was a market hall, a stable, a power plant, a water tower that doubled as a landmark. And there was the greenstone church, built of green serpentine stone hauled from the east, a single church for what Pullman imagined would be a single congregation. He had not considered that his workers were Catholic and Lutheran and Methodist and Swedish Baptist, that they would not all worship under one roof, and that most of them could not afford the rent he set for the building anyway. The church stood beautiful and largely empty. It was the first visible sign of something the visitors did not catch. Pullman had built a town for the workers he imagined, not the workers he actually had. But the visitors did not look that closely, and there was a great deal to admire. Trees and flower beds softened the grid. The streets curved where a curve was pleasant. Serpentine carriage paths and circular beds of flowers broke up the monotony that blue-collar districts everywhere else simply accepted as their lot. The whole place was clean in a way that Chicago, 14 miles north and choking on its own coal smoke and stockyard stench, emphatically was not. The first family moved in on the first day of 1881. Within 4 years, the population reached 9,000. By then, more than 1,000 homes and public buildings had risen from the key prairie where, half a decade earlier, there had been nothing but marsh grass and standing water. The newspapers came. The European visitors came, hundreds of them, treating Pullman on his trips abroad like visiting royalty, and the verdict was nearly unanimous. Here was the answer to the labor question. Here was capitalism with a conscience, industry with a soul, a place where a working man could live in dignity and an owner could still turn a profit. Reformers praised it. Architects studied it. Foreign governments sent men to take notes. And it was all true in a sense. The town was clean. The houses were sound. The air was better. The streets were safer. And a man's children were healthier in Pullman than in the tenements of Chicago. Nothing the visitors admired was a lie. It was the thing beneath the admiration that no one thought to examine. The model town had no town government, no elected officials, no independent newspaper, no public hall where men might gather to talk. It had no private property at all, because Pullman would not sell a single lot or a single house to a single resident. Free assembly was discouraged. Charity organizations were kept out. Independent shops were not permitted. You bought from the company, in the company's arcade, at the company's prices. Town inspectors, paid by the company, could enter any house to check that it was being kept to standard. A man in Pullman lived under one roof, drew his water from one source, drank in one hotel, prayed in one church, shopped in one arcade, and worked for one employer, and all of it, every brick, every pipe, every shelf of goods, belonged to the same man. It was the most thoroughly engineered community in America, and that was precisely the problem. Pullman had built a machine for living, and he had built it the way he built sleeping cars, with himself as the sole proprietor of every part. The residents were tenants of their own lives. So long as the wages were good, few of them minded, and fewer still imagined what the arrangement would feel like on the day the wages stopped being good. The town was a marvel. It was also a closed system with one valve and one hand on it. To understand why the most admired town in America was also, quietly, a grievance waiting to happen, you have to look at the arrangement underneath, the one the visitors never examined. And it comes down to a single principle Pullman stated openly and was proud of. The town would pay for itself. More than that, it would profit. He had never pretended otherwise. When he laid out the plan to his board and his investors, he did not describe a charity or a gift to the working class. He described an investment, and like every investment he made, it carried an expected rate of return. That rate was 6%. The houses, the arcade, the gasworks, the water system, the very church, all of it was capital, and all of it was expected to earn, year after year, in good times and bad, a clean 6% on what it had cost to build. Remember the 6%. Everything that came later grew out of that number. For the worker, the principle expressed itself in rent. A man who came to work for the Pullman Company and took a house in the town did not receive that house as a benefit of employment. He leased it, and the lease was structured so that the rent was deducted directly from his paycheck before the remainder was handed over. He never touched the money. The company paid him, took back what he owed for shelter, and gave him the difference. The rents themselves ran higher than comparable housing in the surrounding towns and in working-class Chicago. By various estimates, a fifth to a quarter more, and the explanation Pullman's managers offered was simple. The houses were better. The streets were cleaner. You were paying for quality. There was truth in this, and there was also the 6% which the rents existed to deliver. The same logic ran through everything else a resident touched. Gas and water were supplied by the company and billed to the resident at rates the company set, and the company bought its water wholesale from the city of Chicago and resold it to its own people at a markup. The shops in the arcade paid rent to the company and priced accordingly. There was no competing store to undercut them because no competing store was allowed. A family in Pullman lived inside a closed economy in which nearly every dollar a man earned found its way, by one channel or another, back to the man who employed him. He worked for Pullman, and then he paid Pullman to live, and he paid Pullman to eat, and he paid Pullman to keep the lights on. And what little remained he might spend at a Pullman shop on a Pullman shelf. None of this was hidden. That is the strange part. Pullman was not running a swindle in the dark. He believed with complete sincerity that he had solved a problem that had defeated everyone else, that he had found the formula by which an employer could do well by doing good, and he invited the world to come and inspect it. The world came, and the world, for a long while, agreed. But not everyone. As early as the mid-1880s, while the praise was still pouring in, a few observers looked at the model town and felt something close to unease. The most influential of them was a Harvard-trained economist named Richard Ely, who visited Pullman and published in 1885 a long and careful account of what he had seen. Ely admired the engineering. He admired the cleanliness, the planning, the obvious superiority of the housing. And then he named the thing that the admirers had missed. The town, he wrote, was fundamentally un-American. Everything in it was provided, and nothing in it was owned. The residents had no voice in how their community was run. No vote, no property, no power to assemble or organize, or even to read a newspaper that the company had not approved. It was, Ely concluded, a benevolent, well-cushioned feudalism, in which a man traded his independence for comfort and might not notice the trade until the day he wished to undo it. The people of Pullman, he observed, were not citizens. They were residents at the pleasure of a corporation. The phrase that stuck was the comparison to feudalism, and it stung precisely because it was accurate. A medieval lord, too, provided housing and protection and order, and took, in return, the labor and the loyalty and the deference of the people who lived on his land. Pullman had built something genuinely new in its plumbing and genuinely old in its politics. The serf had become a tenant, the manor had become a company town, and the lord now wore a frock coat and rode. The rails in a private car, but the essential relation, dependence flowing one way, authority the other, had not changed at all. Pullman was unmoved by the criticism when he noticed it. He believed the people who lived in his town were fortunate, and by most measures they were. He believed they were grateful, and many of them, for a time, were. What he did not grasp, what a man of his temperament perhaps could not grasp, was that gratitude and resentment are not opposites, and that a person can feel both at once toward the same benefactor. A worker could be glad of his clean house and his children's health and still chafe, in some place he could not quite name, at the fact that the same man signed his paycheck, set his rent, owned his church, and could send an inspector through his front door. Comfort did not cancel the chafing. It merely postponed the day it would be spoken aloud. And so the town reached its peak, admired, prosperous, and outwardly serene, with the crowning recognition still to come, and the praise of reformers ringing in Pullman's ears. He had reason to believe he had built something permanent. The houses were full. The rents were paid. The 6% came in, reliably, year after year, exactly as he had designed it to. What no one in the model town yet understood was how completely that arrangement depended on one fragile condition. It worked only so long as the wages held. The whole machine, the rent deducted before the paycheck was handed over, the markup on water, the prices in the arcade, assumed that the money would keep flowing in at the top, that a man would always earn enough that the deductions left something behind. Pullman had built a system with no slack in it, no give, no margin for the day the orders stopped coming. He had not built it that way out of cruelty. He had built it that way because, in 20 years of being right about everything, it had not seriously occurred to him that the orders ever would stop. They were about to. By the early 1890s, the Pullman Company stood at the height of its power, and the height was considerable. The works at the town employed thousands of men building the green and gold cars that ran on nearly every major railroad in the country. The operating side of the business, the conductors and porters who staffed those cars in service, extended the company's reach onto the rails themselves, across the continent and beyond. Pullman cars ran in Britain, in Italy, in Mexico. The company had become not merely a manufacturer, but an institution, a fixture of American travel so familiar that to ride in comfort was simply to ride Pullman, the word and the thing indistinguishable. It was in these years that the company quietly became something else as well, something whose significance would not be fully understood for decades. To staff its sleeping cars, Pullman hired black men, many of them formerly enslaved, as porters. They made beds, shined shoes, carried luggage, served meals, and absorbed the moods of the traveling public for long hours and low pay, dependent on tips and on the goodwill of passengers, who often called every one of them George, after George Pullman, as though they had no names of their own. The company became, in time, the largest single employer of black labor in the United States. Out of that workforce, decades later, would come the first black labor union to win a contract with a major American corporation. But that is a thread for the end of the story. In the 1890s, the porter was simply part of the machine, another component in the great apparatus of comfort that Pullman had assembled and owned. And the town hummed along beneath it all, the visible proof that the apparatus had a conscience. Consider what it meant to live there in those last good years. You could wake in a brick house with running water, on a street named for an inventor, and walk to the works through clean air. You could draw your wages, less the rent the company had already taken out, and carry what remained to the arcade, where you could buy your bread and your boots and borrow a book from the library. You could send your children to the company school. You could see a play in the company theater. You could fall ill and be tended in the company's care. And when you died, you could be buried out of the company's church and laid in ground the company had arranged. From the first breath to the last, a man in Pullman could live an entire life without ever stepping outside the boundaries of a single corporation. And for a long time, the arrangement felt less like a cage than like a kind of security. The safety of knowing that every need had been anticipated and every provision made. There were rules, of course. There were always rules. Inspectors could enter to check the upkeep of a house. Behavior was watched. Drink was confined to the Hotel Florence, where the prices kept the working man out. Talk of unions was unwelcome, and a man known for it might find his lease in question or his name on a list. But in good times, the rules were the price of the comfort, and most residents paid it without much complaint because the comfort was real and the alternative, the tenements and the smoke 14 miles north, was real too, and worse. Then, in 1893, the floor gave way. It began far from the town, in the financial markets, where years of speculation in railroads and silver and easy credit collapsed in a matter of weeks. Banks failed. Businesses that had seemed unshakable closed their doors. It became known as the Panic of 1893, and it touched off the worst economic depression the country had yet experienced, a downturn that would grind on for years and throw millions out of work. And it struck directly at the heart of Pullman's business, because when money grows scarce, the railroads stop buying new cars, and when the railroads stop buying, the works in the town fall silent. The orders Pullman had assumed would always come stopped coming. The company's response was swift and, by its own lights, rational. To keep the works running at all, Pullman went after new contracts by bidding low, taking jobs at or below cost simply to keep the men employed and the shops from going dark entirely. To make those low bids possible, he cut wages. Over the second half of 1893 and into 1894, the company slashed pay across the works, by some measures a quarter, by others nearer a third, with certain trades cut far more steeply than that. The workforce itself was gutted, falling from well over 5,000 to roughly 2,000 at the worst of it, and those who kept their jobs often found themselves shifted to piecework that paid less for more. And here the design of the town turned, with terrible precision, against the people it had been built to protect. Because the wages fell, but the rents did not. This is the hinge on which the entire story swings. So it is worth saying plainly, the same company that cut a man's pay was also his landlord. And as his landlord, it did not lower his rent by a single cent. The rent was fixed. It was deducted first, before the man saw any of his money, taken straight out of the diminished paycheck by the company that had diminished it. Pullman drew a careful, deliberate line between the two halves of his enterprise. The manufacturing side, he said, was suffering and had to economize. The The town side was a separate investment, a matter of real estate, and real estate was entitled to its return. The 6%, in other words, would be protected. The wages would absorb the depression. The rents would not. Remember the 6%. This is where it does its work. A man might labor a full 2 weeks in the shops, and when the company finished deducting his rent and his water and his gas and whatever he owed at the arcade, the slip handed back to him might show a balance of almost nothing. There are records of paychecks reduced to a few dollars, to a few cents, to figures so small the men carried them around and showed them to one another in disbelief, like relics of a joke no one found funny. One worker, it was said, received a pay envelope containing 2 cents. Families that had moved to the model town for dignity now could not buy enough to eat, and could not leave, because they owed the company money, and the company controlled the houses, and there was nowhere 14 miles from anywhere to go. The trap had been built years before, in the cleanest brick and the best plumbing in America. No one had called it a trap then. They had called it the most perfect town in the world. Now the men in it began, quietly, to count what they had left, and to find that it came to pennies. In the spring of 1894, the men of Pullman did the only thing left to people who have been pushed past the edge of what they can bear. They organized. That winter they had joined, in large numbers, a new and ambitious union called the American Railway Union, founded the year before by a railroad man from Indiana named Eugene Victor Debs. Debs had built the ARU on a radical principle for its time. Instead of dividing rail workers by craft, the engineers in one brotherhood, the firemen in another, the conductors in a third, he gathered all of them into a single industrial union so that their strength could not be split. In its first year, the ARU had won a strike against the Great Northern Railway, and the victory drew workers to it by the tens of thousands. The men of Pullman, desperate and newly enrolled, believed they had found at last a force large enough to stand against the company. In May, a committee of workers went to the company to plead their case. They asked for one of two things, either a restoration of wages or a reduction of rents, some easing of the vice that was crushing them between the two. The company met the committee and listened. Then, within a day, 3 of the men who had served on it were laid off. The company denied the firings were retaliation. The workers did not believe it, and neither, frankly, should anyone. On May 11th, 1894, the workers of Pullman walked out. The great works fell silent. The most perfect town in the world was on strike. For a few weeks, the strike was a local affair, a single company's labor dispute, and it might have stayed that way and been forgotten, except that the strikers appealed to the National Union, and the National Union was meeting in convention in Chicago that June. The delegates heard the Pullman workers describe their wages and their rents and their 2-cent pay slips, and they were moved, and they voted to act. If the Pullman Company would not negotiate, the ARU would refuse to handle Pullman cars. Switchmen would not couple them. Trains carrying them would not move. It was a boycott, and given how many railroads ran Pullman cars, it was a boycott aimed at nearly the entire rail network of the United States. Debs was wary. He understood. Better than the men cheering in the hall, how much force the railroads and the government could bring to bear, and he urged caution, but the mood had passed beyond caution. By late June, the boycott was on, and it spread with astonishing speed. Within days, rail traffic across the country, and especially west of Chicago, began to seize up. At its peak, the boycott involved 250,000 workers and paralyzed the lines from Chicago to the Pacific. For a moment, it seemed the Union had found the lever that could move the immovable company. The railroads had a lever of their own. The lines were organized into an association called the General Managers Association, and they had no intention of letting a union dictate which cars they would pull. They began hiring strike breakers, and they reached for a weapon far more powerful than any picket line, because they understood something the strikers had perhaps underestimated. The Pullman cars that the boycott refused to move were also very often the cars that carried the United States mail. Stop the trains, and you stopped the mail. And interfering with the mail was a federal crime. The Attorney General of the United States, Richard Olney, was a former railroad lawyer who still sat on railroad boards, and he moved against the strike with the full weight of the federal government. In early July, the government obtained a sweeping injunction from a federal court ordering the strikers to cease interfering with the mails and with interstate commerce. It was so broad that it forbade Debs and the union's officers from so much as speaking or telegraphing in support of the boycott. To violate it was to be in contempt of court. And then, over the strenuous objection of the governor of Illinois, who insisted the state could keep its own peace, President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops into Chicago. The soldiers arrived on July 4, 1894. The sight of the United States Army marching into the city to break a strike enraged the crowds rather than cowing them, and the situation, which had been tense but largely orderly, turned violent almost at once. Mobs gathered in the rail yards. Cars were overturned and set ablaze. Hundreds of freight cars burned in the Chicago yards in a single night, the flames visible for miles. Troops and marshals fired into crowds. Men were killed. The precise number was never firmly settled, but the dead ran to perhaps 30 across the country, with many more injured, and the rail yards of the city the Union had hoped to command became instead a battlefield, strewn with broken glass and burned timber and blood. It had taken Pullman years to build the most perfect town in the world. It had taken less than 2 months to fill its surrounding city with soldiers and smoke. Debs and the other Union leaders were arrested, charged both with contempt of the injunction and with conspiracy to obstruct the mail. With its leadership in jail and the army in the streets and the mail trains running again under federal guard, the boycott broke. By the end of July, it was effectively over. The men drifted back toward the yards and the shops, those who would be taken back, and many were not, because the company kept lists, and a man known to have struck might find there was no longer any work for him in the most perfect town in the world. The strike was lost. The men had walked out over wages cut to nothing and rents that would not move, and they had been answered with an injunction, an army, and a list of names. But the thing they had set in motion was not finished. It had only moved out of the rail yards and into the courtrooms and the commissions and the long, slow ledger of consequence, where the question of who had truly been at fault in the most perfect town in the world was about to be asked by people George Pullman could not lay off, could not bill for rent, and could not this time simply ignore. The strike was broken, but the reckoning had only begun, and it came from directions George Pullman had not thought to defend. The first blow fell in the courts, and it fell against the workers. Debs was tried for contempt of the federal injunction, convicted, and sentenced to 6 months in jail. His lawyers appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1895, in a decision called In re Debs, the court upheld the injunction unanimously. It was a ruling of enormous consequence, because it blessed the very weapon that had broken the strike. For the next 40 years, the labor injunction would be the favored instrument of any employer who wished to crush a walkout, a court order standing in for an army, and the courts handed them out freely. The men of Pullman had lost, and in losing they had helped forge the legal chain that would bind a generation of American workers after them. But the same events that jailed Debs also put George Pullman, for the first time in his life, on trial in the court of public opinion, and there the verdict went the other way. President Cleveland, stung by the violence his own troops had been sent to suppress, appointed a national commission to investigate the strike. It took testimony through the autumn of 1894, and the report it issued was a quiet demolition of everything Pullman believed about himself. The commissioners examined the wages and the rents and found exactly what the workers had claimed. They found that the company had cut pay without touching rents, that it treated its town as a separate profit center insulated from the suffering of its own employees, and that the famous 6% had been protected while families went hungry. The commission concluded that Pullman's whole paternal system was, in their phrase, behind the age, that the aesthetic beauties the visitors had admired carried no real value for a man who could not feed his children, and that the town's benevolence had become a form of control incompatible with the spirit of a free people. Richard Ely's word, feudalism, had been vindicated by a board of the president's own choosing. Then came the courts again, this time aimed at Pullman. In 1898, the Supreme Court of Illinois ruled that the Pullman Company had no legal right to own and operate a town at all, that running a model municipality was outside the lawful purposes of a railroad car corporation, and it ordered the company to divest itself of all property not used in its actual business. The town was to be sold off, house by house, to private owners. The holy experiment was over by judicial decree. The residents of Pullman would, at last, be permitted to own their own homes, not as a gift, but because a court had stripped the company of the right to keep them as tenants. George Pullman did not live to see the town taken from his company. He had died the year before. In 1897, at 66, his health and his reputation both broken by the strike and its long aftermath. And here the story arrives at the detail with which it began. So bitter was the hatred against him, so real the fear that vengeful workers might desecrate his body, that his family buried him at night in Graceland Cemetery in a way no ordinary man is buried. His coffin was lowered into a pit reinforced with concrete and railroad ties, then covered with more concrete and a layer of asphalt, the whole mass weighing many tons so that no one could ever dig him up. The man who had built the most perfect town in the world was sealed beneath the earth like a hazardous thing, entombed against the people he had been so certain would thank him. His estate passed, in part, to a man whose name carries its own weight in this story. The presidency of the Pullman Company went, in time, to Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of Abraham Lincoln, whose funeral train had made George Pullman famous 3 decades before. The ark closed quietly. The car that carried the martyred president had launched the fortune. The dead president's son inherited the empire it built, and the town itself simply became a neighborhood. Annexed by Chicago back in 1889, it was absorbed into the growing city, its houses sold to the families who lived in them, its grand public buildings passing through a long, slow decline. The Pullman Company kept building rail cars there for decades, but the world that needed them was shrinking. The great works finally ceased car production in the early 1980s, and the buildings fell silent and empty. In 1998, a fire, believed to be arson, gutted the historic Clock Tower Administration Building and the adjoining erecting shops, leaving the most recognizable structure in Pullman, a roofless brick shell open to the Chicago sky. It might have ended there as a ruin. It did not, because by then, the people of the neighborhood had decided that what had happened on their streets was worth remembering. They had been organizing to save Pullman since the 1960s, when a plan to bulldoze the whole district for an industrial park was beaten back by residents who refused to let it go. They rebuilt the burned clock tower. They won the town protection as a landmark, layer by layer, until in 2015 a president stood and designated the town of Pullman a national monument. The works and the Hotel Florence and the Greenstone Church and the row houses preserved by law as a place where Americans could come and learn what had been tried here and what it had cost. And one thread outlived all the rest. The porters, the black men who had made the beds and answered to a name that was not theirs, organized in 1925. under A. Philip Randolph into the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and in 1937, after 12 years of struggle, they forced the Pullman Company to the bargaining table and signed the first labor contract between a major American corporation and a union led by black men. The company that had been built to make a docile workforce ended by training, in its own sleeping cars, some of the men who would help build the movement for civil rights. Walk the streets of Pullman today, and the grid is still there. Den grid is still medicine. The brick houses still standing, lived in, their inventors' names still on the corners. The clock tower has been raised again from its ashes. The Hotel Florence still bears the name of a daughter, and the greenstone church still stands no longer empty. The town built to perfect a man and to return him 6% forever returns nothing now but its lesson, which is that you cannot own a person's whole life and call it kindness, and that the people you are most certain will thank you are sometimes the ones already counting in the silence what little you have left them.